It's Aaron, and welcome back to the podcast. Today, my guest is the Reverend Jake Dell. He is the pastor at the First Congregational Church of Woodbury, Connecticut, which was founded in 1659. So that's an old church, to say the least. There are a lot of very interesting things about Reverend Dell. He's an example of a real life example of an Operation Reconquista success. For those of you who remember my interview on that, I'll link to it in the show notes if you're not familiar with it. We'll talk a little bit about what it is. And he also has a really interesting idea for a donor intent litigation trust to force these churches and institutions to actually honor the wishes of the people who had donated the money in the past. So I'm very interested in talking about all of that. So Reverend Dell, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me on, Aaron.
I know you were originally a minister in the Episcopal Church. How did you first sense that you wanted to go into the ministry or that you were called to ministry?
It's an interesting story. I grew up in the late 70s, early 80s, so I'm solidly in the Generation X, and I was one of the early nuns. My mother was Roman Catholic, my father Presbyterian. They got married, decided not to raise me in anything. So I was raised as a nun. And in the late 80s, I was in a Catholic school and my friends were all getting confirmed, which to them, I think meant that they could stop going to church. For me, I thought, well, this is great. I actually want to join this. And so I started to pursue the joining the church. And it was funny because it was about at that time my dad got religion insofar as he didn't want me to be a Catholic. So he said, well, the family's Presbyterian. So I ended up getting baptized in a Presbyterian church out in Pasadena, California, which was where I was living at the time. I fast forward, I went to, I became an undergraduate at Yale University, came to New Haven, and I was immersed in this sort of colonial Congregationalist, but even more so at that time, this Episcopal world. And I had sensed a call, even when I was going to the Presbyterian church in California, and they made me a deacon in that church, and a number of retired missionaries. This was right near Fuller Seminary, so there were a lot of retired missionaries in the area. Came up to me and said, "Have you ever thought you might have a call?" And I didn't really know what they meant, but something hit me the summer between my senior year and my freshman year at Yale. I had an experience where I was at the Cathedral of St. John the Divine in New York City. I was there with my father. It was Easter. I walked out that day and turned to my dad and said, well, that's what I'm going to do with the rest of my life. And he said, what? And I said, whatever that was. And so I pursued the idea of a call pretty aggressively as an undergraduate. And it was there at Yale in the early 90s that was really the whole politically correct movement was cresting at the time. Donald Kagan was the dean of Yale. He was really fighting for Western civilization. And there was we can maybe get into this later because there was sort of an original donor intent fight there. It was, the Bass family had donated the largest, up until that point, the largest gift in Yale's history, $20 million to found a Center for Western Civilization, which was eventually rejected by the university. All of this is to say is that I got a sneak peek 35 years ago to the crisis that's happened in our culture since the late aughts, the late teens, 2020 and so on. So I was told fairly early on in my quest to pursue this calling that the church didn't really need any more people like me. And by what they meant, I think what they meant by that was, straight, white, heterosexual men, particularly conservative ones. And I didn't hide the fact that I was pretty conservative at the time. So I was, my call was frustrated during that 4-year period. And I kind of wandered for the next 10 years or so. And eventually reconnected with a retired bishop in the Episcopal Church who really encouraged me to pursue it. I enrolled in in what was at the time one of the first distance or hybrid learning programs at Nashotah House Theological Seminary, which was a conservative Episcopal seminary. Completed my degree, 2 years hybrid, 1 year in residence. And I was eventually able to be ordained in the Episcopal Church by one of the remaining conservative bishops. It was in the Diocese of Albany, Bishop William Love. And so he ordained me a deacon and then later under his authority, a priest. So, I saw early on the need for a Reconquista. I never called it that, but I knew these institutions were a shadow of what they had been. I could see it at Yale. I could see it at the Presbyterian boarding school that I went to for my senior year, which wouldn't have, no one would know it was Presbyterian, and
Mhm.
and in the same way, no one would have known Yale was a Congregationalist school at any point in its history. And increasingly, it was becoming clear to me that these churches were not even recognizably Christian. So I eventually, I was called and ordained in the Episcopal Church. Served that church happily for close to 15 years, held a number of positions. One was at the national headquarters office in New York City in digital marketing, digital evangelism. I pioneered some of the early efforts in that. And then in two congregations, two parishes, one in New York City and one in Dutchess County, New York. Um,
So
what I
you
found happen was after 2020, the environment really changed all the way up until, say, 2015, before Obergefell and before the Episcopal Church changed its canons on marriage. There was, I think, this sense that we still need the conservatives, right? And so I was told and I was promised that there was always a place for us at the table. There would, the Episcopal Church was a big tent. And for maybe about 5 years, from 2015 to 2020, that was true. After 2020, I found it just seemed like they decided to double down. Certain elements of the leadership decided to double down on everything woke, whether it was critical race theory, apologizing for slavery, purposely running minority candidates for bishop. And really, I think, they were boasting about, all women or all Black or all people of color candidate slates for bishop. And so the white man really had, no place left in the church. And, I think if, especially what I found is as soon as I started to speak up, that, I was really basically just shown the door, both in terms of employment opportunities. And then I was the victim of a disciplinary campaign that was weaponized, particularly because of my involvement with Reconquista. By that point, it was used basically to blackball me and my prospects for employment in the church. So I resigned in 2024 and began looking in greener pastures. And I knew that there were conservative congregational churches. I didn't know much about them. I knew that Connecticut had a lot of them from my time at Yale, and I just began to look and started to network. And eventually, last August, through a group in the United Church of Christ called Faithful and Welcoming Churches, which is a group that pre-exists Reconquista. It's sort of a boomer version of it. And by that, I mean, it's a little milder and softer. It advertises itself as a place for evangelical, conservative, Orthodox, and traditional members of the United Church of Christ to have fellowship and congregate and support each other. So Bob Thompson is the director of that, a retired UCC minister, retired from Corinth Church in Hickory, North Carolina. He graciously added me to his email list, and then First Church in Woodbury advertised its opening last August on that email list, and I made the connection and interviewed and was called in November of last year.
we should probably briefly tell people what Operation Reconquista
Sure.
is, because I don't know everybody watched my podcast with Redeem Zoomer
Right.
about it, but is it fair to say that Operation Conquista is a movement to essentially reclaim mainline churches and denominations for theological orthodoxy?
Yes, I think that's exactly what it is, and it's also, with it is this idea that it, leaving them should be the, last resort, the last recourse. That these are the rightful patrimony and heritage of generations of American Christians, and this is, I think, something you often write about. I mean, it's part of the fabric of the institutions of this country. You can't walk away from a Yale or a Harvard without losing something that goes way back. And so, as much as I admire the theological purity and, frankly, the fellowship and the witness that you'll find in newer churches sometimes, my own church is 355 years old. It's literally the first church in this area, the first church of this town the town and the church were established together. You couldn't start a church in Connecticut. You couldn't start a town in Connecticut without a church back in the day. So to let these institutions fall into the hands of the cultural Marxists and theological left is to lose. It's to concede defeat. I have nothing but respect for those who fought hard in the Episcopal Church in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and aughts, and then decided that they had to form the Anglican Church in North America. I know many of them. My former bishop is now one of them. At times I thought of joining them. So I have nothing but respect for them. But I always thought that their departure had to be only a temporary move, that they really needed to refocus on how do they gain strength and come back, because this is the church. These are their churches, and there are still faithful, as Bob Thompson likes to say, from faithful and welcoming churches. There are still evangelical, conservative, Orthodox, and traditional members of these churches. And by some accounts, Ryan Burge's data shows something like 58% of mainline Protestants voted for Trump, right? So there is a severe disconnect between the people in the pews and their leadership. Now, I'm worried that the people in the pews are dying off, and the leadership is just going to go to, take the proceeds to the bank as these properties are sold and these endowments are impounded and sort of wrapped up to the layers, diocese or judicatories one layer up. So I think there's, I've written about that as well. And I think Reconquista is basically coming along and saying, no, you don't get to sell our birthright. And we're talking about Zoomers here, the Gen Z, right? And they're angry about this because this, not only of their churches, not only do they look out and say that their churches have been stolen from them, but their prospects of finding a spouse or their prospects of finding, good, stable paying work, all of this they perceive has been stolen from them. And so they don't have the boomers' reticence, and they're quite comfortable with images and words that hearken to a more militant time in church history.
I mean, given your experience with the Episcopal Church, I'm kind of surprised you would be optimistic about something like Operation Conquista. What makes you feel good about it?
Well, I'm a happy warrior. There are days when I'm not optimistic. There are days when I look at this and think this is impossible, right? But I think then, I teach a Bible study on Wednesday evenings for my church. We're going through the Westminster Shorter Catechism, but it's keyed to all the scriptures. And as I said last Wednesday, I said the story of the Bible is always one of God hitting the factory reset button on the human race, right? He's always willing to take us back to an original purity, an original state of righteousness through his son, Jesus Christ. And because of that, the underdog in biblical history is the one that comes out on top, right? So it's David versus Goliath. It's Gideon with his 300. It's the Israelites who are not a remarkable people, right? God doesn't choose them because of that. They're not the most numerous or anything. And so he uses them. And same with Jesus. I mean, he was despised and rejected and scourged. No one thought anything of him, and they walked by and spit on him. So I think that's basically the gospel right there. And the optimism is not so much in my own strength or in any particular merit that's left in these churches. The optimism comes from the Lord.
Yeah. And before we move on, I just want to hit one thing for people who don't understand all these denominations and how they work. A lot of these denominations, the name of the denominations refers to the way they're governed. So Episcopal Church is governed by bishops. The Presbyterian Church is governed essentially by committees of elders. And Congregational churches are governed by the congregations. So they're independent churches that are governed by congregations. And the United Church of Christ, if I'm not mistaken, is basically the current, if you will, denomination for most of the old Congregational churches. Many of them still go by the name, United Church of Christ,
right?
Even if they have. Is that kind of the way we lay it out?
That's pretty accurate. Yeah. What I discovered in the past 24 months is that there are two other important Congregationalist bodies that trace their roots back to Puritan times. Both of which are actually, I think, older than the United Church of Christ. Not by much. The United Church of Christ only goes back to 1957. The Conservative Congregational Christian Conference goes back to the 1940s. So there have been mergers down through the centuries. But by and large, the United Church of Christ is the largest and most well endowed and probably most well known.
Yeah, so Congregationalism, I guess, is similar to a Baptist church in the sense that the
Hmm.
local churches are each autonomous and the actual members vote. I think a Congregational church famously voted to fire Jonathan Edwards as their
I
pastor
think that's right.
because
Yeah,
they didn't like him. So it seems like something like Operation Reconquista works pretty well in a Congregationalist polity, because if the people in that church want you, you're in. Whereas in the other ones, like the Presbyterians and the Episcopal, the denomination has tremendous power over
that's right.
churches
There's a
around.
lot of gatekeepers. Now, I think that Congregationalism will save this, save the Protestant church in this country, because I think that's really where this movement can and is taking root with objective success. There's an old story, an old saying that I think the Congregationalists and the Methodists, took the Conestoga wagons and the horses and rode west. The Presbyterians, or no, I think it was something like the Methodists rode horses west, the Congregationalists took the wagon trains, the Presbyterians and the Episcopalians waited for the Pullman to come. So, I
Mm-hmm.
think that might be similar here, that what is beginning and what is taking root and what is showing to be a possible success is happening in the Congregational church. I spoke to someone from the now Global Methodists 2 days ago. It will take longer for those Episcopal or Presbyterial bodies to embrace this, but I think time is on our side. The cohort of boomers, whom I love because everyone likes to pick on them as being this liberal generation, this Woodstock generation that ruined the culture in the country. But the reality is that they're the most conservative generation too. They're the basis. They're the base of the red part of the Republican Party. So we're going to miss this generation when they leave. But I think when they do leave, what's coming after them will open up opportunities for real change.
So, what was the state of First Congregational Church when you got there?
So they were about to close. They had lingered on until 2019, and in 2019 they were on the eve of their 350th anniversary. They voted to suspend worship in 2019, but hold an anniversary. They wanted to have a celebration. There was a stalwart group of about 8 to 10 members who were not ready to vote to close. And then I think here's where COVID ended up being providential, because COVID shut down everything before they were able to have their celebration, or before they were even able to suspend worship themselves. They had voted to suspend, but they hadn't done it. So COVID happens. That throws everything into disarray for about almost 2 years. The 8 to 10 stalwarts kind of crawl out from the cave that the lockdowns put us all in, and they decide they're going to still meet. The deacons organized worship about once a quarter. They'd bring in a visiting minister, or they would just meet by themselves. They'd used Spotify for the music. One thing that they decided to do was that because they were not meeting regularly, they were going to have communion every time they met. So that's something we've picked up now that we've gone back to weekly services. We have communion every Sunday. So that's been a blessing. Sometime in 2024, that remnant decided they wanted to try once again. They looked at the money they had in the bank, which isn't a whole lot, probably about enough to fund a minister for 2 or 3 years. The physical plant is in decent shape. So they decided they'd make one more attempt. That was a bold leap of faith, because the clergy employment market right now is terrible. There are churches that pay 3 or 4 times as much as what they can pay here, that can't find ministers, particularly in the Northeast, where if you're more conservative, if you have a young family, this is not an attractive place to come. Um,
And it's
and
expensive to live.
and it's expensive, right? And I ran into that in my own search. Churches that were persuaded to sell their parsonages over the last 20 or 30 years, so that their ministers could have a housing allowance and build equity. They're really reaping the whirlwind right now, because the housing prices have shot up, and they cannot pay their potential pastors enough to buy a home near the church. So this church fortunately had not done that. The parsonage is, I'm looking at it right now, it's, a stone's throw from the church. So they decided that they would try once again. At this point, I was sensing a very strong call to come back to Connecticut. As I said, I went to Yale, but then I lived here for I lived in Connecticut for 18 years before I moved to New York. So my children grew up here. I know this state, and I had a strong sense of call to come back. And when I saw this church, I walked into it and I said, we cannot turn our backs on 350 years here. We have to try. And I told them, I said, I'm going to throw everything I can at this. It looks like we've got about 2 years to try to make a go of this. I'm just so you know what you're getting. I'm very conservative, and I have a sense that I need to engage politically, not just, I'm going to preach the gospel, but I'm going to apply the gospel in all areas of life. And that includes politically, because one of the lessons I think I learned coming out of COVID was that the church may not be interested in politics, but politics was sure interested in the church. And if politicians could close churches and keep liquor stores open, churches had better realize what time it is. And that means they need to reorganize themselves as a political entity, as a political voice, as a voice that shows up at the town meetings and that shows up in the state house and makes its presence and its voice and its will, frankly, known. So I said, I'm not just here to get the Sunday school or the vacation Bible school back up and running. I'm here to really tap into the ancient root here of back when church and town were one in Connecticut, and see what we can do. And so God has blessed that. We've gone from that 8 to 10 stalwart members to about 40 who are coming on Sundays now. We had admitted another 10, 12 new people in April. So we've doubled our membership, and I've got another crop of new members that want to go through in September, probably for an October membership ceremony. So that God is blessing the work here. And I think he's blessing the faith of that little remnant that decided that they were going to try one more time for their old church.
Yeah. I mean, I think what's interesting about this in terms of Operation Reconquista and what you're doing, it's not necessarily that there's this extremely wealthy, tall steeple church that, we want to take that one. Most of these churches are dying, quite honestly.
That's right.
And incredible legacies, patrimonies are going to disappear.
That's right.
And, the buildings are going to get turned into condos or whatever's going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not about taking, so to me, it's not about taking over so much as it is about reviving and sustaining, a heritage that goes back, to 1659. I mean, that there must be a weight of responsibility. We think this thing was founded in 1659.
That's right.
Long before the United States itself existed, this thing was here.
It was founded during the English Civil War, right? Or right during the interregnum, right? I mean, it's...
Yeah, so it's and I think about the average evangelical church is probably like less than 35 years old.
Mm-hmm,
much less 350, put another zero on that.
Mm-hmm.
And, it's one thing to build something that's successful for a generation. It's something else to create something that is still there hundreds of years later.
Well, that's it. And one of the things that really sealed the deal for me was I was reading the church history online when I was interviewing. And then when I met them in person, I shook hands with the deacon, and his name is Matthew Minor. And I said, Matt, are you related to the John Minor who founded Woodbury? And he said, yep, 10th generation. So we have a deacon in this church, and there's always been a deacon, from that family in this church for 10 generations, right? So this is the kind of, I'm actually not a post-millennialist in my theology, but this is really the kind of covenantal blessing that post-millennialists like to talk about. God has blessed this place, and I think he's blessed Connecticut, right? And it doesn't look like it now because this alien power has occupied so much of New England and the Northeast, but that's not what's in the soil here. This is a prayed over part of the country where faithful Christians have labored for generations, and the blessing is still here.
Yeah, I think there's like a number. I heard some pastor preach a sermon about all the times in the Old Testament. It says that, like, even up hundreds of years after King David, God would say that he was holding back on his judgment against
That's
someone
right.
for the sake of his servant David.
Right.
Because David's servant, I'm not going to obliterate you right now.
That's right.
300 years later.
That's
And I
right.
think there is that kind of interesting uh, things there. And you think about something like that. Now, of course, I think my observation is kind of a mixed blessing to have 10th generation people, because a lot of times the multi-generational people in that, it becomes kind of cliquish,
Mm-hmm.
and also they become very resistant to change. How did you navigate some of that? I mean,
Well, I
were
didn't
these
have
people
to.
ready
God,
to take an open-handed posture
they
towards
were
we
they
have
were
to
ready.
reinvent?
They were
Yeah.
ready, and that's one thing that was obvious to me from right away, is that God had already done the spade work. He had already pulled all the weeds and the roots, and disciplined these people to the point where they were ready for him to act and to move. Right now, I've certainly been in churches, and I even interviewed with some that were faithful, orthodox, conservative. I mean, they were everything I could have wanted, but they were still in the there was still enough money in the bank, still enough of the legacy that they felt that they had to curate, and that it was they wouldn't want they weren't open to what I was suggesting that they do. This church had been literally taken to the root, cut to the root, as Isaiah says, right? So they were ready for that, and I think that God is probably doing that across the board. When I first, you were the one who put me on to Redeemed Zoomer, probably in 2023. So when I first wrote an article about that for TruthScript, one of the things I pointed out was that, as you just said, Reconquista is not going to work in rich, endowed churches, because they still have a ton of institutional gatekeepers and legacy, members who are guarding it. But that's not the church we're looking at. We're looking at all of the little ones that are increasingly closing and being sold. Just go look on Zillow right now and type in churches and see how many are for sale.
Yeah. Yeah, it's there's a huge number. It's something else out there. It's so many. Yeah, I just read something that there are a surplus of 100,000 church buildings in America. I'm actually going to have somebody on the podcast to talk about the real estate
Yep.
issues as well. What do you think has been the secret to growing that congregation there? What have you done that maybe other people could learn from?
So there's three things. The first, I'll talk about me first and what I've done. The first was just discovering a sense of boldness and purpose that was missing before. I was always a gospel preacher, but I pulled my punches in my preaching. And largely that was because, instead of the bully being in the pulpit, the bullies were in the pews. And I never wanted to preach outside of the unspoken lines, whether it was a time limit, 15 minutes or something, or political, something you couldn't talk about. So I always found my way, I always found a way to preach that was probably clever by half, right? Too clever by half, as they say. So I just dropped that and started, emphasizing in the application portions of my sermons how to apply the gospel with regard to apostate churches, even if they are right down the street from us, to politics, to bad bills that were being debated in Hartford. I testified up at the Hartford Assembly against a bill, a constitutional amendment that would legalize partial birth abortion right up to the minute of birth. That got me a lot of notice. That got me new members right away. So, and people said, finally, a pastor willing to take a stand. Finally, a pastor who's willing to speak the truth and boldly. What I have found, and this is the second thing, is that a lot of Christians have left the church. They've left the institutional church. But that doesn't mean they've stopped practicing their faith. They're meeting in living rooms and around people's kitchen tables on Monday nights or Wednesday nights to study the Bible and pray together. And there are hundreds, if not thousands, in Connecticut who that I'm in touch with now, a network where I keep hearing they've given up on the pastors, even the conservative ones, because they're like the prophets that Isaiah and Jeremiah castigate, dogs that won't bark, right? So my advice would be to get up there in the pulpit and start barking, and you will call these Christians out of the shadows and into your church. So those are two things that you can do right away. The third thing that I would credit the success to is the spiritual landscape. This part of Connecticut, as I've discovered, has been prayed over for decades. There are itinerant preachers here that I've met. There's an itinerant pastor who comes by Woodbury, who's actually another one of these 10th generation Connecticut guys, right? But I'm told that he has prayed at this church, the church I'm now in, for decades, that he would come up to the front doors of the church and pray, the demons out of it. And so that you can't, that has to be there already. But I knew last summer that God was calling me back to Connecticut. In fact, I remember reading that passage in Acts sometime in July, where Paul purposes to go. I guess I forget. I think he purposes, or he wants to go to Macedonia, but he ends up getting redirected. It says the Spirit of Jesus resisted them. That was my experience last summer, where church after church, where I thought this is going to be the call, this is going to be the one, the Spirit of Jesus resisted it, right? I mean, and until this one opened up. And then once I got here, the call was so fit like a glove. And then I discovered that it had been prayed for and prayed over for decades. And so those are the three elements I think you need to think about as you attempt a Reconquista. Are you willing as a pastor to not just preach the gospel, but apply it to all aspects of life? Do you have a boldness here? Are you willing to bark like the bulldog that God calls you to be? And then third, what's the spiritual condition, of the landscape? Who else is in the area operating and praying and who has already done the hard spiritual spade work that's necessary for revival?
So you think this is a model that could be repeated in some way?
I think the first two, the boldness and the application, yes. But even the boldness has a spiritual component that I don't think you can just conjure this or summon it, right? We're not magicians. I was ordained for 15 years before I found that boldness, right? So, but when you find the boldness and when you decide to act on it, when you decide to apply the gospel to the whole, all of the gospel for all of life, as I think Kuyper said, right? When you decide you're going to do that, and then when you find an area that has been prayed over, and I think that's most places by this point, then I think those three things can combine. There are other strategies that we can talk about, like legal ones and political ones, but you have to have the spiritual basis, the foundation first, the willingness to be bold in your gospel proclamation, the willingness to, and when I say apply, I mean the sheep are dumb, and I say that with love in my heart. But you have to put their noses in the application. You can't preach a sermon against lust and not make the application that goes to the point of saying, now John, that means you can't be having sex with Betty, right? I mean, you have to really connect the dots in the application. And if it means saying you cannot vote for this person, you have to write to your congressman and say this bill is opposed, you're opposed to this bill for reasons of your Christian faith. You need to say that from the pulpit. And up until last week, pastors could lean on the excuse that they would lose their tax exempt status, or that it was against the law to preach politics from the pulpit, but no longer, right? So there is no more excuse.
Well, you mentioned some legal strategies, and I want to transition to that right now, because you had this idea for a donor intent litigation trust, which I just like the name of it, but what is it and how would it work?
So this is an idea that I've been kicking around. One of the benefits of going to Yale is you end up knowing a lot of lawyers. So I've kicked this idea around with, white shoe law firms, partners at white shoe law firms in Manhattan. And all of them have, when I've told them what's going on and what I'm facing, all of them have said donor intent, donor intent. This is not what people gave money for. A classic example that I came up with was the First Congregational Church in Bridgeport, Connecticut, which if you drive by it now, you'll see a crescent on the steeple because it's now a mosque. Now, the church, very well may have had very good reasons to sell the church, and even perhaps in the Islamic Society was the appropriate buyer. But I can guarantee you that the donors to that, who gave the money to build that church decades ago, never intended for it to be a mosque, right? So I think there's the possibility here to discover a class of people who are the descendants of, in some cases, bequests that may go back centuries. That if you pool all of these bequests, are now worth millions, if not billions of dollars. And these successor organizations, these successor denominations, which I call them zombie denominations. I think you've used that term, zombie institutions. I'm not sure who coined it originally, but basically the idea is that they're on autopilot. There's motive in them. They're able to move and buy and sell, but there's no life in them anymore, at least no gospel life. So there's zombie denominations, and yet they've inherited millions, if not billions, in liquid assets in terms of endowments, but also real estate, right? And so they're turning into real estate investment trusts with a progressive agenda, not Christian denominations. And that's not what Aunt Sally or Grandma donated $500 of GE stock for in 1920 to see happen, right? So I'm looking for some creative lawyers, litigation teams who see in this the potential for something like a big tobacco settlement, or even the child abuse scandal in the Roman Catholic Church settlement, right? To go out there and identify this class of people, which, with genealogy records being the way they are, thanks to Ancestry.com, ought to be fairly easy to do. And then to open up the archives of these churches. Again, with something like artificial intelligence, we ought to be able to scan this fairly quickly and come up with some real, obvious wins, cases that would be clear, open and shut violations of donor intent. And what we need to find in those cases are clawback clauses. And what I mean by that is, there's an example from my own church here in Woodbury, where the parsonage was built and donated by the Reverend Noah Benedict in the 18th century. And he opposed what was called the halfway covenant. He was very much against the halfway covenant. And this church, when it was started in 1670, had been a halfway covenant church. Well, when he began his pastorate, he abolished the halfway covenant. And then he donated the parsonage to the church with the proviso that if the church ever, went back to the halfway covenant or in any way departed from his theology, that his heirs would be able to have the parsonage, not the church, right? Well, who remembers these clauses 10 generations later? But they're there. So I think that this is a sleeper, sleeper move, the strategy that God has in his providence ordained for the church at this time. And we're just waiting for, a Christian litigation team that sees this potential and will step in and do it. Now, it also doesn't have to be a loss to the attorneys. I think this litigation trust will pay their bills and maybe even make a tidy profit for the firm. I think it can return a nice payout to those heirs who, in exchange for being part of the litigation, would assign their claim to the trust, but they would get a percentage payout. So if you think about it, a lot of these, heritage Americans are probably heirs to these bequests. They may or may not even be active or involved in a church or even know that they ever had a connection with this church. They may be on hard times. They may be out of work. They may be facing the general decline that has affected so much of middle America, and it would be a nice windfall for them. And then finally, by assigning their claim to the trust itself would keep a percentage of the money, which would then be used to fund the seminary education of conservative men going into the pastorate. It would be used to fund their salaries and benefits in churches like mine that really can't pay for it anymore, right? So again, because we're not going after the endowed liberal churches that still have money. We're going after the ones that are in danger of being shut down, and we're trying to revive them and save them. And then I think the last thing that I would want this trust to do as part of the litigation would be to get something like a consent decree from these denominations that they're not going to use their gatekeepers to keep biblical men out of the pastorate.
Well, I know it's very common for mainline churches to have endowments and gifts that have a lot of restrictions on them. You'll sometimes see a church that's dying, but they've got fresh flowers every
That's
Sunday
right.
because somebody donated money for the special purpose of flowers.
That's right.
And probably a lot of people are not completely diligent about what the money was donated for. I think the idea of these restricted gifts is less the case today because people use different mechanisms for things. But it probably is the case that it wasn't just, oh, I'm giving this to you for a purpose, but I'm giving this to you, and there's a legal restriction on what that thing.
That's right, and it was a perpetual gift. Yeah.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Yeah.
What was I say? Is this part of Operation Reconquista, or how does this relate to Operation Reconquista?
So I think Operation Reconquista right now is a distributed network, right? There's not a central controlling committee or even person. I mean, Richard Ackerman, Redeemed Zoomer, gets all credit for coining the term and really making it into something on the internet and then in reality in the Presbyterian Church. But I think it's also something that's happening across the board. I mean, the work you're doing, the work that someone like Chris Rufo is doing, all of this, I think, fall under the general banner of Reconquista, right? There's a general recognition that these institutions have drifted very far from their moorings, from their original purpose, whether that's what you think the federal, whether we're talking about the federal government and bloat there, or state government, or courts that have overreached with their decisions like it did in Obergefell or Roe v. Wade. So, there's a kind of originalism that Operation Reconquista, I think, there's kind of an originalist wave that our Operation Reconquista is riding right now. I've long thought that we needed some kind of legal leverage or strategy to tame these churches. As I said, I found in my own case, I was just, the victim of a weaponized disciplinary process, and then an old boy network, or really by this point, an old girl network that blackballed me and kept me from applying or even getting interviewed at conservative Episcopal churches that would have otherwise been, I think, happy to hire me. So there's this closed shop, machine mentality that operates in these denominations that has to be broken open and broken up. And whether that's, when I look at what RICO legislation was designed to do, or class action lawsuits like Big Tobacco, these settlements, they were all of these legal vehicles and legal strategies were created to address this kind of syndicate problem. Well, what are denominations if not syndicates? And they've operated with impunity under the First Amendment up until now, which is largely okay if they're doing what they're supposed to do. But when they're no longer churches, when they're no longer identifiable as Christian, Protestant, Reformed, Anglican, or whatever, bodies, then it's time in the interests of public trust. I mean, the government has a fiduciary duty to act. The Attorney General has a duty to act. You can't operate something as a church, call it a church, when it's really no longer doing that. And so I'm looking for cases that are black and white, open and shut. I don't want the courts to wade into matters of theology. And I don't expect them to, and I know they won't do it. There's all kinds of legal doctrine that say they won't do it. But when a church is found, when a pastor is found giving chest binders to a minor child so that he can transition to be a girl, and when that's against both, policy and law, that's an open and shut case for the Attorney General to get involved and say, what's going on here? And while we're here, what else is going on here? What are you really doing with this money that's been donated? What are you really doing with the land that you own? Why are you, as is in the case of New York State or Connecticut, why are you backing legislation that will strip towns of their zoning their right to zone their own land, so that you can get in bed with developers to develop these white elephant properties you have as quote unquote low income housing, right? There's a tremendous amount of self-dealing that's going on at the denominational level that is so far removed from spreading the gospel, even a liberal progressive version of the gospel, right? They're not even doing that anymore. So I think it's time and I think the time is ripe with both donor intent and other machinations that these denominations are involved in, for attorneys general, and maybe even the attorney general to take a hard look, to scrutinize these groups. And I think with the falling of the Johnson Amendment, with that, I think I think all bets are off now. Pulpits can now speak politically, but the state can also, I think, shine the light on what some of these churches are doing, nefarious things these churches are doing in the name of Jesus.
Well, with your donor intent litigation idea, I just want to try to understand: is the
Mm-hmm.
goal to get the money back? So it's about getting money, or is the goal to use this as a lever against institutions to gain institutional leverage?
Both, because I want money to be extracted from the system, both to pay the heirs and also to fund a trust, which then goes right back into putting biblically faithful men in the pastorate of these churches, right? This is not so that we can fund the Presbyterian Church in America with PCUSA money. This is not so that we can fund the Global Methodists with United Methodist Church money, or the Anglican Church in North America with Episcopal Church money. This is so that those splinter groups have every reason to send their men back into those denominations and retake them, starting with the low-hanging fruit of those little churches that are about to close.
You already have one target in mind, and you wrote an op-ed in the Hartford Courant about it, which is Yale University and Yale Divinity School. Tell me about that.
So the dean of Yale Divinity School, Mr. Dean Sterling, wrote an op-ed in the Hartford Courant, basically attacking the Trump endowment tax plan, which I think is taxing endowments at 21%. And he basically pointed out that if you tax the divinity school's endowment, you're robbing future communities of the benefits of trained, seminary trained ministers. And it costs a lot to train these men and women, and they don't go out into high paying jobs. So don't tax our endowment. And I decided that would be an opportune moment to push the donor intent idea and get eyes on it. So I wrote an editorial response, and basically I agreed with Dean Sterling that the administration doesn't need to tax the endowments, but rather they should back, efforts to examine and make sure that these endowments are being used for their original purpose, right? So let's take a hard look at the bequests to Yale College and Yale University over 300 plus years, right? And let's go back and say, okay, is it really being used for the purpose for which it's been intended? So that was a high profile example of where this could succeed. And so I put that editorial out there, and the current ran with it.
I guess my last question is: this just an idea at this point, or has anything actually happened to implement it yet?
So this is where your audience could help me. I am doing this on my own dime at this point and with my own time. So I'm very open to talking to attorneys. I need to set up a 501c3. I need to get a website up and running. I need access to archives. I need people to come forward who are aware of bequests that are not being used for their intended purposes. I was on the Pugcast, the theology Pugcast, and then with the Hartford Courant editorial, people are starting to contact me, including attorneys, litigators who are taking an interest in the case or the possibility of the case. But I haven't yet reached critical mass here, and so that the more eyes we can get on it, the better. I think it has the potential to be something. What we need is really some obvious cases and enough people to make a class. I was talking to somebody yesterday 2 days ago from the Global Methodists. He told me there were 7,800 churches where this could be a potential payout, right? Where these, where all this money that had been given to support Methodism was now being redirected, and that, they had walked away, and to add insult to industry, they had to pay an exit fee, right? I mean, so, I think that, the more the word can get out there, the more I think people will come forward with copies of bequests, and lawyers, then litigation firms especially, can see this as an attractive opportunity where they're not going to lose money, and where they might stand to actually make a sizable payday.
Well, I'll keep an eye out on this, and if any big such paydays occur, I'll be sure to let my readers and such know. So again, my guest today has been Reverend Jake Dell. He is the pastor of the First Congregational Church in Woodbury, Connecticut. Reverend Dell, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you, Aaron.